Amidst the crumbled ramparts, the German survivors encountered an invisible yet persistent foe: starvation. Food stocks were depleted, the countryside ruined, the rail lines wrecked, and millions of uprooted individuals struggled over the same crust of bread. The rations allocated by the occupying forces barely sufficed to sustain an adult's life. For youngsters and the aged, they represented a lingering sentence. Every sunrise brought a frantic hunt. Whether swapping possessions for tubers on the illicit market or trekking many miles in what became known as starvation treks toward farmstead hamlets, neither beliefs nor frontiers held any weight. Everyone in metropolitan areas and small towns shared the identical void within their bellies and the identical dread of failing to survive until the following dawn. They lived in a landscape of total desolation where humanity was stripped to its most basic instinct. The collapse of East Prussia and the Vistula Oder campaign. During the initial weeks of January in 1945, while Western Europe was suffering through the final German push in the Ardennes, on the eastern boundary a disaster was brewing. The Soviet military, refitted following its successful march since the prior summer, was gathering battalions for a strike that would not merely shatter the German defense, but would hasten one of the most significant human catastrophes of the conflict: the brutal vanishing of East Prussia and much of Silesia as regions settled by Germans. The intentions of Stalin were evident: to carve a ruinous path to the Oder, crushing resistance and sweeping up the civilian masses left in the wake. The hamlets and cities of East Prussia, until that moment somewhat removed from the heart of the clashes, started to see streams of displaced persons. They were the earliest to arrive from Masuria and Baltic lands, carrying accounts that sounded like horror stories, and which many still thought were exaggerated: females violated in groups before their offspring, elderly men executed against their own garden walls, young girls vanishing in the darkness, never seen again. The Wehrmacht, restricted by the commands of Hitler to maintain every post until the final bullet, could not arrange a systematic retreat, and thousands of households found themselves stuck between the winter frost and the surging crimson wave. It was an era of profound suffering, where the old social order disintegrated entirely under the pressure of the advancing front, leaving common people to fend for themselves against a tide of steel and ice that promised no mercy to those who stood in its way or tried to shield their loved ones from the inevitable. On the 12th of January, the Vistula Oder operation commenced. Under a leaden atmosphere, more than 2 million Soviet troops backed by 34,000 cannons started a barrage that transformed the German positions into a nightmare of churned soil and mangled remains. The earth vibrated for many hours, and into the breaches created by the blasts, the Soviet foot soldiers surged like an unstoppable flood. The German battalions, many diminished to clusters of youngsters from the Volkssturm and recovering veterans, were crushed within moments. There existed no organized withdrawal, merely a frantic escape where residents and combatants overlapped on the chilly paths. In Königsberg, the atmosphere reeked of smoke and trepidation. The accounts arriving from Nemmersdorf, a tiny settlement turned into a symbol for cruelty after its brief seizure by Soviet forces months prior, traveled among the residents as both a caution and a doom. National Socialist outreach had displayed images of garroted females and deceased youngsters. And although some of the data was distorted, the core of the point was accurate. The Soviet military brought retribution. That payback, stoked by years of Russian agony under the German conquest, did not separate the culpable from the blameless. The paths clogged with lines of horse-drawn wagons, cycles, makeshift sledges, and individuals on foot shrouded in quilts and tatters. The frost gnawed the skin until it turned dark, and every pause in the journey represented the hazard of being abandoned indefinitely. Soviet strafing aircraft, the Ilyushin II Sturmovik, soared over the paths, attacking any cluster of moving shapes without identifying regalia. Many displaced persons threw themselves into ditches, shielding themselves beneath the snow to prevent being struck. In Gumbinnen, a cluster of religious sisters attempted to move 100 orphans. The line was halted by Soviet troops who isolated the nuns and seized several youngsters. Days later, a few corpses were discovered at a woodland perimeter. Those who survived told that laughter and Russian exclamations rang out in the darkness before the shots. Incidents like these occurred repeatedly, and the hamlets were converted into ghost towns, with unlatched entrances and boot tracks etched in the snow mingled with obsidian stains. The battalions of Zhukov and Konev pushed forward with a velocity that surpassed their own estimates. In under 2 weeks, they had traversed Middle Poland and reached the Oder River. The rapidity of the push meant that massive pockets of residents were left stranded. In spots like Allenstein or Elbing, the pathways were a collage of toppled decor, remains hidden by fabrics, and starving canines prowling through debris. Soviet order crumbled as they neared actual German soil, and the commanders ignored the thievery of timepieces, jewelry, attire, provisions, and people. The most intense tragedy occurred on the frozen banks of the Baltic. Thousands of residents attempted to board any reachable vessel as part of Operation Hannibal, the largest naval rescue in records. The congested ports were heartlessly struck by Soviet planes. Amidst the mayhem, German troops tried to enforce a feudal discipline. Parents pleaded for their offspring to be taken aboard. The aged dragged themselves to the ramps. Commanders struggled to favor army staff. On the 30th of January, the ship Wilhelm Gustloff was struck by a Soviet sub, claiming more than 9,000 lives. The bulk were females and youngsters escaping from East Prussia. In regions that came under Soviet rule, existence altered within moments. Dwellings were taken by troops, pantries cleared, and young males detained under vague charges of conflict violations or helping the enemy. Many females used desperate methods to endure. Some sought the safety of a Soviet commander to escape being violated by others. Others concealed themselves in garrets or cellars for days without sustenance or liquid until the thud of boots went away. The dread of night patrols combined with the conviction that nobody would arrive to assist them. The mental trauma of the push was crushing. In merely 3 weeks, East Prussia, the source of much Prussian martial heritage and the honor of the German upper class, was shattered. The Nazi leaders, holding to the talk of total battle, had doomed the civilian masses to stay trapped. Many of those who succeeded in reaching the West did so scarred by deprivation. Youngsters who vanished in port crowds, spouses left behind failing to walk, fathers who fell from fatigue in a frozen trench. The Soviets arrived, rescue in lines of displaced persons. It all started as a whisper, a stream of dread flowing through hamlets and towns from the eastern side. The Russians are approaching. That rumor, which in earlier weeks had been part of the outreach to stiffen battle, became a concrete alert when plumes of smoke rose on the skyline and the heavy thuds of cannons were heard far off. Households packed what they could carry. A chest, a sack of attire, stale loaf, some fat wrapped in cloth, images that were the final items left of a whole existence. The highways and country tracks turned into human tides flowing slowly toward the west. Wagons hauled by steeds, cycles packed beyond limit, makeshift sleds over the ice, and many walking with youngsters clinging to their torsos or palms, and elderly individuals who could scarcely move. Those who had luck succeeded in boarding a troop vehicle or an open rail car. The remainder relied on their limbs and on the climate, and in that January of 1945, the climate was another foe. The Russians, in their push, did not separate troops from displaced persons. Meredale explains how many combatants of the Soviet army, toughened by years of conflict and deaths, saw in any German a chance to avenge their fallen. The strafing aircraft dipped low over the lines, releasing volleys of lead and missiles on the mass. It was sufficient for a cluster of retreating German troops to blend with residents, for the whole line to become a martial mark. The noise of an Ilyushin nearing caused immediate terror. Parents hurling themselves over their offspring to shield them, males fleeing to the sides, steeds bolting, and wails blending with the thunder of blasts. Amid that flood, households split apart. A lone second of chaos was enough to lose track of a child or parent. Some tried to go back to find the lost person. Most could not because halting meant being vulnerable. The ice on the paths sliced through boots, and the snow occasionally colored with gore and silt hid corpses that nobody could enter. It was common for the frailest, the very aged, the ailing, to be left in the gutters, shrouded in quilts that quickly turned pale with frost. The few paths to the Baltic and naval rescue spots were actual traps. The harbor of Pillau, for instance, was packed with displaced persons who'd been lingering for days to board. Amid starvation, filth, and the steady risk of Soviet strikes, the harbor became a spot of total hopelessness. The German troops tasked with managing entry to the vessels favored army staff, officials, and conflict casualties. Residents could only board if they succeeded in shoving their way through by power or if they paid off some commander with gems or timepieces. On the paths westward, starvation and frost claimed their toll. Meridale gathers accounts of Soviet troops, who after stopping refugee lines, told of sights that they themselves termed agonizing, even for a Russian toughened by conflict. Youngsters too frail to sob, females with icy feet, households dividing a final scrap of bread. Yet mercy was uncommon. The gathered hate and the silent commands not to delay the push left minimal space for kindness. The Soviet push was so rapid that many lines were caught between the boundary and the coastline. Failing to move or retreat, they huddle in hamlets and towns, awaiting a rescue that never arrived. Occasionally, the only thing they encountered was hostile lead and prompt rule. The hamlets filled with Russian exclamations, barked commands, and the sound of footwear and rifle ends hitting portals. Females hid in cellars, barns, or even waste pits to escape violation. Many failed. Accounts were shared among survivors of whole dwellings robbed, of neighbors killed for not providing timepieces or sustenance, of youngsters who vanished without leaving a trace. The naval rescue, when reached, did not ensure safety either. The packed vessels were simple marks for Soviet subs and aircraft. After the sinking of the Wilhelm Gustloff, terror rose, and still thousands continued to swarm onto docks ready to chance everything for a trip toward the west. Some who succeeded did so only to find upon reaching safer harbors a chilly welcome, makeshift detention centers, lack of sustenance, and ailments spreading freely within the huts. For those who stayed behind, the trip's end was not safety, but rule. With the arrival of the Red Army, the existences of those who had been unable to flee were narrowed to a daily fight to endure robbery, harm, and forced toil. The paths, now deserted, were signaled by the debris of wagons, fallen steeds, shattered decor, and corpses hidden by snow, quiet observers of a mass flight that had been both a getaway and a sentence. This giant movement, one of the biggest in European records, was not noted for decades in its actual size. The counts of dead are judged in the hundreds of thousands, but what cannot be quantified is the collective shock, the sense of total displacement. Having lost not merely a dwelling, but also the fellowship, the self, and in many situations the whole household. For those who endured, the thought of the frozen path, of the noise of aircraft nearing, and of the final look at their hamlets before vanishing indefinitely stayed carved as the last sight of a Germany that would never exist again. Mass rapes and sexual violence. When the eastern boundary fell and the Soviet units crossed East Prussia, Pomerania, and Silesia, the conflict assumed a cruelly personal shape. Harm stopped being a far-off strike or a street clash. It became something that entered dwellings, forced entrances, went down into cellars, and seized control of frames. The massive violations that accompanied the Soviet Army's push were not a lone event, but a trend recurring again and again in metropolises, hamlets, and meadows with a size that the observers themselves found hard to grasp. In the initial hours after the Army's arrival, when martial defense was put out and the boundary shifted further, began what many German females termed the Second Conquest. Troops in tiny clusters or makeshift scouts walked the paths seeking timepieces, footwear, spirits, and females. They often crashed into dwellings following whispers or mere noises behind partitions. Maturity did not count. Youngsters, parents, aged females, nuns, all could be targets. Bodily harm was random and in many situations shared. Garth notes accounts of females violated repeatedly by 5, 10 or more males in a lone night, often before family or neighbors. The drive blended the thirst for payback, the coarsening of years of conflict, and a habit of quiet allowance. Soviet outreach had drawn the German troop as a hollow demon shifted to the resident folk, and this portrait excused any payback. On the eastern boundary, the memories of German cruelty in Belarus, Ukraine, or Russia stoked a hate that sought bodily venting. The frame of the German female became a sign of the beaten foe, a land that could be seized and shamed. Dread defined daily life. Many females sheared their hair, rubbed their faces with soot, and wore tatters to seem less tempting. Some parents hid their girls in hidden walls or under stacks of wood. Others tried to guard themselves by sticking to a lone troop, taking a forced bond in the hope of escaping multiple violations. The cost of that safety was to stay a captive in their own dwelling. Those who found no safety spent nights shifting from one hidden spot to another, trying to guess where it would be safer when the footwear and hits at the portal arrived. Bodily harm was not restricted to the Red Army. In spots held by the French, and to a lesser degree, Americans and British, violations also happened, though in lower counts. In southwest Germany, imperial units of the French military, mainly Moroccan troops, were liable for noted harms against German females, echoing sites that had already happened in Italy years prior. Yet, it was in the East that the size reached points experts judge in the hundreds of thousands, maybe more than 1 million targets. The effects were ruinous. In the near term, the bodily shock included grave wounds, unplanned births, and the giant spread of intimate ailments. In the long term, the mental impacts blended with a forced hush. In post-war Germany, speaking of what had occurred meant risking being shamed, blamed, or brushed aside. Many females hid their trial for decades, even from their offspring, carrying with them a weight that showed itself in sadness, terrors, and doubt of any male-shapen regalia. Some targets picked ending their lives, unable to face what they viewed as a permanent loss of honor. In whole hamlets, the count of female self-harm rose after the arrival of Soviet troops. Local records tell of streams and pits that gave back bodies of whole households who picked dying together rather than yielding. The conflict had wrecked cities and militaries, but in this last stage, it also wrecked closeness, belief, and the most simple sense of safety. Garth notes that although the act was done by individuals, the martial setup that allowed it and the lack of penalties made these violations a broad trend. There were rare situations in which Soviet commanders hit troops for these harms, but the rule was hush or excuse. For many targets, the sense was that nobody would arrive to help, that the night was lasting, and that each day one was only a pause before the next stop. The winter of 1945 left in the thought of these females something more than the loss of their dwelling or the death of kin. It left a hidden scar, a steady prompt that, in conflict, harm does not always arrive from the sky as explosives, but can crash into your own space, snap you inside, and compel you to stay moving, as if nothing had occurred. The massacres in German cities and villages. In the final months of the conflict, the German martial ruin did not arrive alone. It was joined by a flood of harm against the resident folk that converted whole towns and cities into spots of quick killings and massive paybacks. As the Red Army, and to a lesser degree other Allied units, pushed into German lands, or spots lived in by Germans, killings happened that, although hidden for decades by the thought of Nazi acts, left a permanent mark on the groups that felt them. One of the most famous events due to its outreach use and the visual accounts that lasted was the Nemmersdorf killing in East Prussia in October of 1944. When Soviet units briefly crossed the Angarap stream and held the hamlet, they found residents, mostly aged people, females and youngsters, who had been unable to flee. The bodies later found by German units and conflict writers showed marks of harm, violations, and killings. Females bound to wagons, frames hung in sheds, and youngsters dead in the gutters. Although Nazi outreach grew some points to feed dread, even later probes admitted the extreme harm done to the helpless folk. With the last push of 1945, what had occurred in Nemmersdorf was mirrored, sometimes on a bigger size, in dozens of spots. In Silesia, whole hamlets were flattened after Soviet troops met real or thought resistance. The hunch that German troops were hiding in a dwelling was enough for everyone there to be shot. Desbois notes accounts of survivors who told how after packing the folk in the court, they were split into clusters. The males were pulled away and killed, the females and girls moved apart to be violated, and many of them killed later. In some situations, flame ate the dwellings with people still inside as shared penalty. The killings were not restricted to the near battle zone. In Czechoslovakia, mainly after the German surrender in May of 1945, harm against the German few took on the shape of a clearing. In Brno, the so-called Trek of Death forced roughly 20,000 people, females, aged folk, and youngsters, to walk toward the Austrian boundary without liquid or sustenance. Hundreds died on the path. In the hamlet of Postoloprty in June of 1945, units of the military and Czech bands killed more than 700 Germans, including teens, in payback for the Nazi rule. Harm was also unprompted, born of stored angers. In spots like Prerau, observers told how a railcar holding German residents was halted, and all its people, including 71 youngsters, were shot in a previously made hole. The charge of having helped the Nazis was used randomly. No probes were made, no court dates were given. The mere fact of being German was sufficient. In Poland, the arrival of the Red Army was followed by acts of local bands seeking to clean the taken spots. Desbois notes how in cities like Bromberg and others in Pomerania, the German folk was packed in courts, and whole clusters vanished without a trace, likely killed in near woodlands. The identical logic was used for farm hamlets. First the theft, then the removal of those who might ask for ownership. The killings were joined by public shames, forcing survivors to walk through paths where identifying marks cleared debris under curses and hits. In many situations, targets were forced to watch the killing of kin before feeling the identical fate. The goal was not only bodily removal, but also to snap the heart and wipe any mark of German roots. Though in some situations Allied commanders tried to halt the harms, the general frame helped safety from punishment. The conflict had made a mind in which payback was seen as quick law. The outcome was that hamlets and cities that had survived years of clash were cleared within days, their folk killed or pushed out. In the thought of the survivors, these events stayed as open scars worsened by the formal hush that followed in the post-war years. For decades, speaking of the killings meant risking being blamed for easing Nazi acts. It was not until the end of the 20th century that it started to be systematically noted and admitted that in the mess of the conflict's end, thousands of German residents were killed in their own towns, not for what they had done, but for what they stood for, the beaten foe. The mass expulsions and the silenced Russian killings. When the killings stopped and prompt push-outs were not feasible, the leaders of the eastern lands used another tool. The massive detention of the German folk in makeshift spots or in centers previously used for captives of conflict, ordinary thugs or political captives. Between 1945 and 1947, tens of thousands of ethnic Germans, males, females, and youngsters went through these centers, which in many situations were fatal. In Poland, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, and Hungary, the centers served a dual part. They were a human storehouse where those who were to be pushed out in later moves were packed, and at the same time they worked as penalty hubs. The logic was evident: to snap bodily and ethically the German folk so that it would not fight the seizure of their lands and the ethnic reshaping of the area. In Czechoslovakia, the Beneš rule allowed the making of gathering centers for the Sudeten Germans. Centers such as Postoloprty, Terezín, or Brno held thousands in cruel states. The Terezín Center, which during the rule had been a ghetto and move hub for Jews on their path to Auschwitz, became after the conflict a detention hub for Germans. The sheds meant to hold dozens were packed with hundreds of people. Water was scarce, and ailments, typhus, gut sickness, lung sickness spread without check. The account of a survivor noted by Douglas says, How the guards, Czechs in this situation, hit the captives daily, with rifle ends and sticks, and how the bodies lay stacked for days before being taken. In Poland, identical centers rose in former Nazi hubs such as Jaworzno or Świętochłowicz. In Zgoda, death reached points equal to those of a conflict death camp. Extreme lack of food, plagues, and shared penalties were the rule. Survivors told that the penalties included making captives stand for hours in the open, stopping their food for several days, or making them face ritual hits to remind them of Germany's acts. In Yugoslavia, the Germans of the Banat and the Baka, the Danubian Swabians, were held in centers such as Nikanin, Rudolfsgnad, Gakovo, and Yarek. These were not mere move hubs. They worked as forced toil centers where captives cut wood, worked on soil drying, or on build-back with barely any food or medic help. The death counts were terrifying. In some of these centers, up to one-third of the captives died in under 2 years. Starvation, ailments, and quick killings ended the frailest first, the aged, the sick, and youngsters. Douglas also notes that in many of these centers, the care was planned to be shaming. Speaking German was banned under threat of hit. Captives had to wear identifying marks. Public shames were done, such as shearing females' hair or forcing them to do bodily tiring work without proper attire. Stops from global groups were rare and managed, which allowed the leaders to hide the size of the harm. Although formally these hubs were meant to ensure peace until the final pushout, the truth is that thousands died before their turn to be moved arrived. For many, leaving the center did not mean liberty, but a trip in cow cars toward a ruined Germany without family, without dwelling, and without means of life. The thought of these centers has stayed broken. Few images, partial notes, and long hush in the formal history books of the lands involved. Only from the 1990s, with the unsealing of files and the systematic gathering of accounts, has it been feasible to rebuild the record of these spots. What comes out is a view of massive detentions, where pain was a goal in itself, not a mere side effect, and where the idea of law was mixed with shared payback. The robberies and the lootings of the hordes. When the boundaries shifted and the cities swapped hands, theft arrived as a second wave of ruin, varying but equally wrecking. Wherever the holding units, Soviet, Polish, Czech, Yugoslav, and even Western Allied went, the line between conflict gain and common theft vanished. Theft was not only allowed. In many situations it was urged, shown as a path to pay for years of pain under German rule. In the East, the Red Army systematically broke the German plant and farm setup. Whole plants were pulled apart bit by bit, marked and packed onto rail cars bound for the Soviet Union. Heavy tools, gear, engines, cars, power hubs, and even full-making lines of goods vanished within days. In Silesia, for instance, cloth gear plants and coal pits were broken until they were useless. The identical happened with chemical plants and steel hubs in Pomerania and East Prussia. Theft was not restricted to plants. Stores and shops were cleared, and Soviet lines left, packed with attire, food, cows, and grain. What could not be moved was wrecked, ovens broken with hits, motors filled with grit, sheds lit on flame. The goal was not only to take assets, but also to stop anything helpful from staying for the Germans who stayed in the spot. In the home zone, dwellings were searched without prior alert. Troops and armed folk entered and seized timepieces, gems, rugs, silver, radios, and even underwear. Households who had not been able to flee saw their dwellings cleared within moments. In many cities, Soviet units made makeshift markets where they gave or swapped what was stolen. A timepiece could be traded for some glass of spirits, a cycle for a pair of footwear. In Czechoslovakia and Poland, the resharing of German lands became formal rule. The dwellings, farms, and shops seized from the Germans were given to local folk or to settlers moved from other spots, often without any list or pay. The swap of owner was joined by prior theft. Doors, glass, decor, and house tools were taken, before the new people took hold. In some hamlets, Lutheran halls were stripped of bells, seats, and music tools, to be reused or given as scrap. In Yugoslavia, the theft against the German groups of the Banat and the Baka blended state, taking with folk raiding. The farms of the Danube Swabians were termed property of the people and shared among Serbian and Montenegrin households, but not before the partisan units cleared barns, cellars, and stores. The cows were shared among martial units or sent to Belgrade. The crops were taken to feed the military. Even in spots under Western rule, there were events of theft. Though American, British, and French units formally kept bans against theft, lone troops, and in some situations, whole units took timepieces, visual tools, music gear, and other small goods. In farm spots of Bavaria and Württemberg, German farmers told of the vanishing of cows and farm tools in the weeks right after the arrival of Allied units. For the Germans who survived the conflict, theft meant the final loss of their life support. It was not only a case of seeing a pantry cleared or a ring taken, the tools of a shop, the gear of a maker, the bar of oxen of a worker, were the gap between being able to build a life or being doomed to needing help. Theft cut short any try at prompt fix and left whole groups sunk into misery. Over time, many of these thefts were made hidden under the formal talk of pay or fair sharing. But in the thought of survivors, the day when the troops arrived and took what little was left after the strikes was carved as a second ruin, more personal and shaming, which finished the fall started by the conflict. The rapes and their unceasing consequences for German women. Sexual harm against German females and girls in 1945 was not a small trend, but a steady part of the fall of the eastern boundary, and of the later rule. It is judged that in Berlin alone between April and May of 1945 about 100,000 females were violated, many of them more than once in the whole of Germany. The counts, though impossible to fix with care, span between 1,400,000 and 2 million targets. Not all lived. Thousands died from hits, from germs, or by self-harm. The Soviet army was liable for most of these harms, mainly in the spots of East Prussia, Pomerania, Silesia, and Brandenburg. The drives were many. Soviet outreach had urged a fierce hate against Germany, showing all Germans without gap of sex or age as guilty of the Nazi cruelties in the Soviet Union. Martial order loosened as the units entered German land, and the gains of conflict were seen as a quiet right of the winner. The coarsening after years of battle and the misery in which many Soviet troops had lived added a layer of theft and shame to sexual harm. But the harms were not restricted to the eastern boundary. In the French rule zone, imperial units, mainly Moroccans, did massive violations in hamlets of southern Germany and Trier, echoing what had occurred in Italy in 1944 during the event known as the Moroccanate. Notes were also made in spots held by the British and Americans, though on a smaller size and with bigger formal penalty for the guilty. The targets were of all ages. Girls of 8 or 9 years, teens, young parents, pregnant females, and aged females over 70. The notes gathered by Garth and Beaver tell of group violations, occasionally before kin or neighbors with a chill that seemed meant to snap the whole group. Many times the hits were repeated for days, with females held in cellars or deserted dwellings as the short-term property of a martial unit. The later hunt took other shapes. Females who had been violated were shamed in their world, wrongly blamed for giving themselves or of having sought the safety of a troop to endure. In clinics and shelters, many hid what had occurred out of dread of being cast out or to escape payback from the local leaders themselves. In Berlin, after the entry of the Red Army, there were whole zones where daily life was paused. Females kept from going out at night or walked in clusters, and households made hidden spots, double walls, floor doors, spaces behind vents. In some situations, young females had their hair sheared or wore in loose and messy attire to pass them off as aged or sick. The bodily and mental effects were ruinous. Many females became pregnant and gave birth to the so-called offspring of the rule, who in the post-war time felt bias in being cast out. Intimate germs, mainly syphilis and gonorrhea, spread in plague shape. The shock made a hush. That in some situations lasted for decades. Even within the household, targets rarely told what had occurred, and only in their last years did they show it, often in spoken or typed notes for experts. There were also females who, in order to endure, made forced or handy bonds with ruled troops. This did not save them from harm, but gave them some safety against others. Yet that plan marked them as helpers in the sight of their neighbors, adding another shame. Sexual harm was part of a wider trend of hunt against the beaten German folk. Random jails, forced toil, theft, public shames, massive pushouts, and in the most extreme situations, quick killings. In the logic of shared payback, the female frame became a symbolic field of battle where the beaten foe was punished and the power of the winner was stated. Forced marches and transit camps for German civilians in 1945. The ruin of the Third Reich did not bring the prompt hush of weapons for all its folk. In the eastern spots held by the Red Army, and to a lesser degree by Polish and Czech units, the conflict turned into a giant, messy, and mean movement. Millions of German residents, aged folk, females, and youngsters in their big bulk, were forced to leave their dwellings on foot in extreme states toward a goal that nobody told them clearly. The commands were simple and mean. Leave the dwelling in a span of minutes, take only what could be held in the palms or on a makeshift cart, and walk in line toward the west. These were not managed moves, but real forced treks watched by armed troops or by local bands who in many situations let out their meanness on the frailest. Whoever could not keep the step due to sickness, fatigue, or age was hit, pushed from the line, and occasionally killed right there. The paths filled with lasting lines, of bent shapes wrapped in quilts pulling hand wagons with the few items saved from the first theft. The winter of 1945 was mainly mean. The heat fell below 10 degrees below zero on most paths, and the snow gales wiped sight, turning every mile into a test to bodily power. Small youngsters were held in arms until fatigue beat their parents. Then they were placed upon the load, still under layers of attire in a nap, from which occasionally they did not wake. In the hamlets they went through, they did not always find safety. Many were void or wrecked. Others had been taken by new people who saw in those travelers the former kings. In several spots of Poland and Czechoslovakia, the leaders made makeshift move centers, often former captive of conflict hubs or marshal spots, where the pushed had to stay days or weeks before being put onto rail cars heading west. The states in these centers were awful. Sheds without heat, broken beds, leaking roofs, and full pits were the rule. Starvation was steady. The daily food could be narrowed to a scrap of dark bread and a thin soup without meat or fat. Ailments, gut sickness, typhus, lung sickness spread fast. Those who became very sick were put apart in rooms without medic care where they waited for death. The bodies piled up, waiting for shared burials, and the smell mixed with that of wet attire and human waste. Harm was not restricted to neglect. Watchers and bandmen, both males and females, used bodily and sexual harm with total safety from punishment. Young females were picked during the night and taken from the sheds. Many came back hours later, bloody and in hush. Others vanished forever. Youngsters were not safe either. In some situations, they were split from their parents and given to local households or sent to care hubs, where reverse German making was forced through tongue and faith. Rail move into the core of Germany was no less mean than the first treks. The pushed were packed into cargo cars without heat, without seats, with a tiny gap as the only source of air. The trip could last several days. In winter, the bodies of those who froze to death stayed inside until reaching the goal. In summer, the heat and lack of liquid caused deaths by drying or lack of air. The shaming of this step was marked by a clear political goal: to wipe the German presence in the lands that now stayed under Polish or Czech rule, and to do so in such a mean way that coming back was unthought. The outcome was a human disaster that, although known in general counts, is rarely told in the first person. Some accounts gathered decades later tell the hard impact left by these treks and centers. A female who in 1945 was 14 years old recalled the point when her parent, too frail to keep walking, let herself fall into the snow and told her to go on without her. The final sight she kept was that of her frame slowly hidden by the cold wind while the line pushed on. Another survivor told how, in a makeshift move center in a former shed, he saw a cluster of captives digging a shared pit under the eye of a watcher who smoked and laughed. Inside lay aged people, youngsters and females who had died in the prior days. In cities such as Breslau, today Wrocław, the step was almost factory-like. The pushed were packed in large squares, quickly noted, stripped of any item of worth, and sent to rail hubs where cargo cars waited for massive move. The smell of the dirty crowds mixed with the smoke of the engines and the steady yelling of commands in Polish or Russian made a hellish world. Though the conflict's end brought peace on paper for those who lived through these forced treks and move centers, 1945 was a year of shame, starvation, and death. It was not only about pushouts. It was a shared penalty done with the harm of those who wanted to wipe not only a foe, but also his thought and bodily marks. Those who lived arrived in the West, drained with broken frames and hearts marked by a dread. That did not fade for decades. The German hospitals and sanatoriums, after the occupation of 1945, abuses, lootings, and expulsions. In the spring of 1945, when the eastern boundary fell and the Soviet army entered the German cities of the East, clinics, rest homes, orphan hubs, and asylums became quiet stages of a unique harm. They were spots that, in theory, should have stayed apart from the meanness of conflict, guarded by the universal thought that the wounded, sick, and aged are not fighters. But in the mess of the Reich's fall, that line vanished. The entrances of the medic wards did not halt either the troops or the local bands, and the hubs that shielded the most frail were changed into spots of theft, harm, and shaming. In Königsberg, a city drained by siege and strikes, the clinics were full with conflict wounded and residents broken by blasts. When the Soviet units entered in April, they soon cleared whole floors to put in makeshift sheds. Beds with dying patients were pulled into halls or directly cleared. And the sick were sent out into the spring snow with no care for where they would go. A surgeon of the time told that the cutting room where he worked was taken to store boxes of Marshall Gain, and that his tools vanished within moments. Medics tried to hide the most frail patients behind screens or in cellars, but hunts and raids were repeated day after day. In Breslau, held for months, the rest homes on the edges saw the arrival of lines of wounded and displaced persons until they fell. When the city gave in, the clinics became gains. The theft of the inner medicine stores was prompt. Morphine, penicillin, numbing drugs, even medics' spirits vanished into the hands of troops or folk who knew those goods were worth more than gold on the gray market of the post-war. The medic files were burned or used as fuel. Patients who could walk were told to leave the spot within a few hours. Those who could not move were left at the mercy of some helper, or in many situations were simply left to die. The nursing dwellings and mental clinics felt an even darker fate. In Pomerania, several hubs were forced cleared to house Polish households newly arrived to take in German dwellings. The inmates, many with brain sickness or fading ailments, were led in small clusters to the edges of towns. Some observers recalled how they were forced to walk bare on cold paths, with torn quilts over their shoulders. Death during these pushouts passed half of those moved. In other situations, the entrances were simply bolted and food stopped being given. A post-war note said that in a mental clinic near Danzig, the staff fled before the arrival of the Red Army, leaving more than 200 patients without care. 3 weeks later, only 14 lived. The violations, far from being restricted to young females in farm spots, also reached medics, patients, and healing females in clinic beds. There were noted situations in which troops broke into birth wards, harming parents who had just given birth and birth helpers. Bodily frailty gave no safety. On the contrary, the lack of guard of the targets raised safety from punishment. Doctors who tried to help were hit or threatened with weapons. In some spots, the clinic leaders themselves, now under martial rule, allowed or even helped troops night entry to certain wards. The orphan hubs, many already packed by youngsters split from their households during the flight, were another mark. In Silesia, several were cleared and the small ones given to Polish or Soviet households, sometimes with the stated goal of reteaching them in the tongue and habit of their new owners. The split was sharp. The youngsters were lined up in yards, given a new name, and their first notes wiped. Other orphan hubs were simply left with clusters of youngsters, wandering through wrecked cities in search of food, many falling target to starvation or street harm. The hunt of German doctors and medics followed political and ethnic lines. Some were jailed under charges of helping Nazism, though most were simply guilty of being Germans in a land that had to be cleaned. In Czechoslovakia, medics were forced to join push-out treks beside their patients, pushing makeshift beds along silt paths. In Poland, surgeons with decades of work were sent to toil centers, leaving whole groups without expert care. At the same time, the stealing of medic gear reached factory sizes. X-ray tools, cleaners, waterbeds, and even cutting lamps were broken apart and sent by rail to the east. Gear stores were cleared within days, leaving the staying sick without wraps, without drugs, without painkillers. The clinics that stayed up after this theft became ghost structures with peeling walls, a smell of wetness, and echoes in empty halls. In cities such as Prague, the steppe assumed an ethnic payback tone. Rest homes, where wounded German commanders were healing, were circled by Czech bands who entered room by room, hitting the patients and forcing them to leave with their wraps still red with blood. Those who could not walk were put onto open trucks and later tossed out on the edges. Many died within moments due to lack of care. In this world, the spots that once held the hope of healing were changed into halls of death. Dying patients died in cold halls. The mad yelled in empty cells. Youngsters were pulled from the palms of their helpers. The formal tongue of the time, move, clearing, fix of hubs, hid the truth. A systematic cleaning that did not separate beaten troops and helpless residents. For those who lived, the sight of a clinic no longer brought ease, but dread. The white coat lost its neutral side. The tiled halls stopped being a safety spot. In 1945, for thousands of Germans in the East, passing the entrances of a clinic meant entering a spot where sickness was not the biggest risk. It was simply one more stage on the map of payback and fall. Hunger in Germany between 1945 and 1947. Among the smoking ruins of the German cities, when the sound of the final shots of the conflict had died, came a quiet and steady foe that separated neither regalia nor banners: starvation. From May of 1945, millions of males, females, and youngsters faced such extreme lack that daily life became a test in bodily and ethical power. The total surrender had not only broken the Marshall machine, it had also crashed the move grids, wrecked the food hubs, and split inner trade. The rail cars were halted or useless. The paths were a lasting band of holes and debris, and the meadows had been left or ruined by the passage of the militaries. In the city zones, life was set around the lasting lines in front of food desks or half-void shops. The food cards printed with cold formal ways gave tiny amounts that rarely matched what was vowed. In the American rule zone, formal food fell to 1,200 calories per day, far below the low point needed to keep an adult fit. And that was in thought, because in practice, the drops were often partial. In the British zone, the count was equal, and in the Soviet one, the sharing relied more on the like of the local leader than on any health plan. Fats were an almost non-existent treat. One egg could be the gem of a week, and a scrap of meat, a rarity that many youngsters only saw in school art. The accounts gathered in those years show the same trend. Females who left before sunrise to walk miles in search of icy tubers, youngsters who searched through the bin boxes of Allied sheds, aged folk who swapped the few worthy items they had left for a grip of grain. Rail hubs became heart spots for trade. Quilts, timepieces, or gems swapped hands for bags of grain or cans of fat from the gray market. The American smoke, turned into a shared coin, could buy a meal or fix lights within the food office. In farm zones, the state was not much better. Though workers could reach their own crops, they were prone to forced takes set by the rural leaders. Allied troops, mainly in the zones held by the Red Army, took grain, cows, and tools, leaving the workers with just enough to live. In winter, the unworked meadows were an icy prompt of the lack of power, of a bloody land to feed itself. In many hamlets, parents sent their offspring to live short-term with kin in other spots, hoping they would find a fuller bowl there. The ailments linked to lack of food spread like a cloud over the folk. Typhus, gut sickness, and lung sickness found good soil in frail frames and packed dwellings. Clinics full and with minimal medic gear could not help everyone. Doctors told of rising cases of starvation, swelling of feet and legs from protein lack, and of dried skin in youngsters, a clear mark of grave lack. In some spots, mainly during the winter of 1946 to 1947, baby death reached scary counts that rivaled those of the worst years of the conflict. The rule powers, far from giving a prompt fix, used rules that often made the state worse. In the first months, both the British and the Americans kept Rule JCS 1067, which banned any step that could help German money fix beyond life points. The thought of demaking Germany meant keeping farm making at the low point needed to escape mass death, but without urging self-power. The outcome was a stuck economy, unable to make dirt food, tools, or gas for farms. In the Soviet zone, the goal was to send food and tools as conflict pay to the Soviet Union, which took local assets even further. Faced with this truth, the German folk made life plans that blended skill, risk, and care. The trend of the hamster fartin rose, secret trips to the woods to swap goods for food, which meant long walks or packed rail trips carrying bags, boxes, or makeshift sacks. Though the rule leaders tried to stop them, the pure mass of people and the prompt need made it impossible to kill them. Family grids became life ropes. Kin in varying rule zones sent each other packs, notes and news of markets where it was still feasible to get loaf or fat. The gray market grew at a fast pace, fueled both by residents and by Allied troops ready to sell part of their food or martial goods and swap for valuables. This illegal trade became a vital part of the post-war economy. Despite raids and fines aimed at stopping it, cities made their own makeshift markets, courts where anything could be swapped for food. There, Nazi regalia could be seen turned into coats, silk shoots changed into underwear, and coins swapping hands, knowing they were worth little next to a bag of bean drink. The arrival of global aid was slow and at first not enough. Help groups such as the UNRWA or the Red Cross centered on moved folk and conflict captives, leaving the German resident folk in the back for political causes and still fresh hates. It was not until the middle of 1946, when the size of the crisis became clear even to the most hard, that large lots of grain, dry milk, and other basic foods started to arrive. Notes from American martial medics, who wrote of grave lack of food among youngsters in the held zones, helped swap views and push for school food plans. The winter of 1946 to 1947 was the peak point. Low heats wrecked crops and froze move paths, worsening a lack that was already long. Food fell to points near 1,000 calories a day in some spots, and the folk turned to swaps, such as root soups or loaf made with faked grains. In the cities, coal was as scarce as loaf, which meant that many households went days without heat, cooking on makeshift stoves, fueled with wood pulled from decor or window frames. Burials were done in hush without rites, often with boxes reused to save wood. When the Marshall Plan started to be used in 1948, the thought of recent starvation was still fresh in the shared memory. The arrival of food, farm tools, and dirt food marked a swap point. The paths that had been the scene of lasting lines started to see better-filled markets, and the word ration started to fade from daily talk. Yet, for those who had lived those years, the trial left a permanent mark. The bond with food was changed. Whole ages learned not to waste even the tiniest scrap, to store jars, and to doubt any sudden plenty. The starvation of 1945 to 1947 not only thinned frames but also changed the social grid. The ethical power of the hubs, both of the rule and the local ones, was eaten by their lack of power to guard the folk. Block care and casual grids swapped a state that barely lived in its most basic shape. And though the counts of deaths by lack of food were never fully noted, guesses point to tens of thousands, maybe more, hidden among the stats of sickness and general death. In the notes and logs of the time, starvation appears as a steady figure. It hid in every talk, set the plans, and picked the shifts. There was no win nor ruin that wiped it, and its cloud reached far past the conflict, telling survivors that peace does not always mean plenty, and that sometimes the hush of weapons is only the start to a more personal and frantic fight to stay alive. The destruction and looting of German archives, museums, and cultural assets. In 1945, in the last months of the conflict, when the Reich was falling and the eastern edges were breaking under the push of the Red Army, German cultural legacy became as wanted again as plants, coal, or rails. It was not only a theft of worthy pieces. It was a systematic act backed by the thought of paying with items, notes, and works of art for the horrors that Germany had let out in other lands. The entry of Soviet units into East Prussia, Pomerania, and Silesia brought with it a flood of seizures that touched museums, records, city files, halls, and schools. In cities such as Königsberg, the messy move left whole sets unguarded. The low stores that were meant to serve as safety for gems became traps. When the boundary passed over, cannon fire and flame bombs ate rooms, and the packing boxes were left at the mercy of troops who did not separate. Between a Flemish art and a rug for their camp. Königsberg, with its famed record hub and the art set of the Albertina School, saw centuries of record vanish in a span of days. Many items were put onto rail cars bound for Moscow or Leningrad. Others were simply stolen by lone troops and vanished forever into the gray market. The East Prussia Museum lost not only items but also the whole of its research files, which made it impossible to rebuild. The source of thousands of pieces. The identical occurred in many cities of Silesia. Breslau, for instance, felt flames that wrecked stores holding notes, scripts, and rare books, some of them lone. The flames were not always the work of battle. There were situations in which units, after stealing what they viewed as worthy, set flame to what stayed as an act of shame or out of simple neglect. In Berlin, while the city fought in ruins, the big museums tried to guard their sets. The Pergamon Museum, the Bode, and the Old National Gallery had packed and hidden their gems in salt pits and unique spots. Yet, those hidden spots became first marks for the Soviet teams, known as trophy groups, units with unique commands to find and move everything of cultural or expert worth. Once they entered, they worked with striking order. They made fast lists, marked boxes with chalk, and sent them on rail cars directly to the Soviet Union. There was no talk nor feasible plea. The museum chiefs, aware of the ruin, sometimes tried to win time by hiding small pieces instead of the most worthy ones. But many of those shifts were pointless. The Soviets had studied the German lists and knew what they were seeking. The theft was not restricted to art. State and city files, which held everything from counts and land notes to old scripts, were wrecked or spread. In part, it was an act of mental conflict. Wiping the typed memory of a city was stripping it of its record. It also served a useful goal. By removing land, deeds, and legal notes, the rule and resharing of lands in favor of Poland or the Soviet Union was helped. In the lands that would be joined into Poland, such as parts of Silesia and Pomerania, the new leaders often helped in the ruin of notes that proved the German stay for centuries. The record void was filled with new formal stories, and the paper proof that could fight them burned in makeshift fires in the courts. School records felt a similar fate. In Leipzig, though the city was in the zone that the Americans would hold, the German retreat and the later passage of Soviet units during the swaps of spots left stores open and unchecked. Books and scripts were used as fuel or given for cents to troops who sent them to their kin as prizes. The records of Danzig and Stettin lost full sets of early prints and sea maps that had steered Baltic trade for centuries. Many of these books rose decades later in Moscow files or in private sets, often without their source being admitted. The thefts included church goods, cups, holy robes, art, and holy items were pulled from halls that were at times still in use. In farm zones where parishes had been the cultural and social heart for ages, the vanishing of these items was felt as a second grief, as painful as the loss of kin. In some situations, priests or helpers tried to bury or hide the most worthy pieces, but the notes of their spot were lost when they themselves were pushed out or killed. The stealing also touched science. Labs and study hubs were cleared. Magnifiers, expert tools, samples from plant and animal sets all were put onto trucks. The goal was twofold: to thin German fix power and to stiffen Soviet hubs. For some German experts, the vanishing of their files and tests was as ruinous as losing a peer. Years of toil vanished in a span of hours. The accounts of those who saw this ruin show a mix of lack of power and shame. A Berlin bookworker told how, upon coming back to her structure after a strike, she found troops stacking rare books onto a makeshift fire to warm themselves. Another account from a museum worker in Dresden says the dry noise of packing boxes being pulled downstairs and tossed onto trucks, with nobody caring about their contents. The worker recalls thinking that they were not only taking items, but the very memory of our city. The theft of cultural goods by the Red Army was to a big extent formal. It was backed as pay for the Nazi theft in the Soviet Union, where cities such as Leningrad and Novgorod had lost priceless gems. Yet the size and random nature of the theft in Germany showed that it was not a measured return, but a giant move of legacy. In practice, the trophy groups acted with free hand, and the commanders who led them vied with each other to send as many pieces as feasible to Moscow. In the Western Zone, under American, British, and French rule, theft was less messy, but not missing. There were systematic seizures of Nazi files, labs, and private sets, mainly of modern art and tech. In some situations, these items were given back decades later. In others, they stayed in museums and schools of the rule lands. The point was that as faux gains, they could be kept forever, although less seen than Soviet theft. The Western one had deep effects for German cultural records since many pieces were joined into foreign sets and never given back. The outcome of this whole step was a ruined cultural view. Cities that had been hubs of study for centuries found themselves robbed of their files, records, and museums. The resident folk, drained and poor, often did not grasp the size of the loss. In the midst of starvation and lack of dwellings, the vanishing of an old script or a Roman head could seem like a far treat. Yet over time, the lack of these items became a concrete void in local self. Whole ages grew up without entry to the bodily proof of their own record. Decades later, the return of cultural goods stolen in 1945 stays a delicate point. Some Russian museums show pieces that arrived as conflict prizes, and that are part of their current self, while German hubs ask for their return. In many situations, source is so wiped that it is impossible to prove to whom they first belonged. The files that could have cleared these queries burned in the fires of 1945 or are locked away in stores to which nobody has entry. The ruin and theft of 1945 were not in certain side harm of conflict, but a planned act that sought to take the bodily record of a beaten folk. By pulling out the cultural roots of whole cities and spots, not only was the present punished, but the future was carved, forcing a shaped amnesia that still has effects today. In the smoke of burning record hubs, in the rail cars packed with art and rugs, and in the files turned to dust, a part of German memory was put out. That no later fix has been able to bring back. 4.